Hello, and welcome back to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm so glad to have you with us today. A few months ago, Father Shenan Boquet, our president here at HLI, wrote his weekly Spirit and Life article on adoption. And this made me realize that we've never actually devoted an entire episode on the show to discussing adoption. So, on today's episode, I ask Father all sorts of questions having to do with adoption. For instance, what's its end goal? How do you know if you're called to adopt? And should single people adopt? I really enjoyed filming today's episode, and I hope you enjoy it as well. As a side note, we did film it right before Pope Francis died, so if we're referring to him in the present tense, that's why. And without further ado, please welcome Father Shenan Boquet to Living a Culture of Life. Welcome back to the podcast, Father.
Always a blessing, Colleen, to be with you and discussing these wonderful topics.
It's always wonderful to have you, especially when you're here between mission trips and I get to actually interview you in studio. So anyway, today we're going to be talking about adoption. Because Father, you wrote an article back in January on adoption, and I realized that we'd never actually done an episode specifically on that topic on the podcast. So it seemed like a good time to talk about it. So
Wonderful.
Let's just start with the obvious question. This is Living a Culture of Life podcast. What does adoption have to do with a culture of life?
Right. And I think I came prepared today with a couple of quotes here. And really, they're coming from John Paul, St. John Paul, and our Holy Father, Pope Francis. And I'm going to begin with John Paul, because it really does open up to, why the culture of life, why discuss this topic. And I think it's John Paul says, to adopt a child is a great work of love. When it is done, much is given, much is also received. It is a true exchange of gifts. And so just kind of breaking that apart, so the idea that, a great work of love, and that's really why it is a pro-life issue. It's a culture of life issue, because we're dealing with an act of love toward another human being in need. And that's really, which ties in very beautifully to Pope Francis, who's been very, very vocal in the recognition of others, that to be mindful of others. And what Pope Benedict, in talking about this, was saying, who's the person in need? Well, it's whoever the person in need is. If they have a need, then there is a need for a response. And so we have a need. We have children that have been either abandoned. We have children that have lost their parents through some tragedy, some difficulty. We have situations where children now are teenagers in foster care systems for various reasons. So there's a need. And I love how John Paul puts that, and in a sense of a recognition, a great act of love, and that both benefit, and which really does make me think of Pope Francis's reflection on the Good Samaritan, that the Samaritan benefits from the person in need, and the person in need benefits from the Good Samaritan. And sometimes one is quite obvious, the Samaritan has a need, and so we see that, but no one really sees the Samaritan himself has a need that is met by this act of love.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up all of the different scenarios too for adoption, because sometimes it feels like in pro-life circles it can kind of get reduced to like adoption as an alternative to abortion for
Correct.
a mom who's struggling, and then or you hear about it just from a couple struggling with fertility. Oh, they should adopt. And so it seems I'm glad that you're kind of bringing up that it's this broader thing in general that isn't just just those two situations.
Exactly, and I think it's good for us to look at those a little bit,
hmm
because what you just outlined, are realities. We have couples today who struggle with infertility, and though we know that not every couple who struggles with infertility is called to adoption,
hmm
and should not be the requisite for adoption. But there are many things that people don't think about,
hmm
so that for a couple who is struggling with infertility, sometimes they don't pray about, is this an opportunity for us,
hmm
that we may not be blessed, through our conjugal love, our gift of each other to each other, and the fruit of our love. But as Pope John Paul talks about, and I know we only have limited time, so I'm not going to read a lot of things from him, but he talks about procreation and also not only being a sense of a biological gift of self,
hmm
self-donation, but procreation is also, because it's a gift of self.
hmm
So adoption is a gift of self. So it has a procreative aspect of it that
Yeah.
doesn't get talked about enough. And I think that's something that not, in couples, even who have been able to welcome children, through the fruit of their conjugal love, to also be open to the gift of another,
Mhm.
that is not the fruit of their biological love, their conjugal love, but by welcoming someone into their home, and which is still a procreative act. It's still a fruitful act of love.
I like how you brought that up as well because we've talked on this podcast a lot about how there's no like quote unquote right to a child.
Right.
How every child is like a gift and that couples can't just say, "Oh, I deserve this by virtue of being a married couple."
Right.
And I think that remembering that adoption is also a gift of self is a helpful way to kind of reframe. It's obviously a great gift to couples who are struggling with fertility to be able to adopt, if that's where they're being called. But at the same time, making sure that we talk about it as this gift to the child and the child is a gift to the parents and not
Right.
just that like the parents can go out and quote unquote buy a child.
Right, right. And I think, as we've talked about many times in our podcast, and that the commodification of a child.
Hmm.
And a child is not a thing, it's not a possession, and as you just articulated, no one has a right to a child. And so here, it's always what is best for the child. What is the good for the child? So you're starting with a person who has dignity, because we're dealing with a person, a child in this case, and
Hmm.
or it could be a teenager, so a younger adult, and so forth. There's so we respect who they are, and so what is going to be best for them. And so always kind of thinking, but it fits very beautifully, right? Because
Hmm.
we've talked about conjugal love in our podcast several times, and that when a husband and wife are giving themselves to each other in a unitive and procreative act, conjugal love, there's always the mindset of the other. You're
Hmm.
thinking of the other. The benefit of being open to life also considers the other. And part of that is the education of that child. So,
Hmm.
education, not just textbook, but the idea of forming, teaching, guiding. So, you're always thinking about the other. And so that's why it's a self-giving act and not a selfish act. And so adoption should be and is to be treated in the same way. It's considering the well-being of the other. In this case, it could be a child, an infant. It could be, a situation that you articulated, a mother who is unable to raise her child, and made a decision for the good of her child to give her child up for adoption, so the child can be, raised in a different environment that she can't provide in that given moment of time.
Hmm.
And or it could be a situation where a couple has struggled with infertility, has prayed, discerned, and said, we just wish to open our lives to another, and and though we cannot through our own, at least thus far in
Hmm.
that moment of life, I've known couples, who have opened their lives to adoption, not thinking they would ever be able to conceive a child on their own, and have adopted. I'm thinking of one family in my mind right now, the friends of mine that welcomed two children through adoption,
Hmm.
and conceived a child not long after the second child was adopted,
Yeah.
and then has welcomed other children. So we again unfolding of God's great love,
Hmm.
for us. And so there are many, many reasons,
Yeah.
and I think it's good that this is a subject that's not talked about enough. I have been very the article I'm referencing, or the quotes I'm referencing from John Paul, is actually an audience he had with families, adoptive families. This was in the year 2000, and so it was a way for the missionary sisters, Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa's community. They've been promoting adoptive families, being open to adoption, and
Hmm.
so he's meeting with them and talking to them and celebrating with them, and so a lot of these quotes are coming from our sainted Pope.
Hmm.
A great lover of the family.
Definitely. What is the primary end of adoption? Is it because I know that people often talk about kind of couples being able to have a child, but is the end the couples being able to have a child? Is it the child being able to have parents? Is it I'm guessing it's probably a both and a little bit.
Sure. And of course, as we've been talking about, so if we think about, it's really a both and,
Mhm.
but really in a sense, it's always directed toward the other. So really the benefit is for the child. Now, as that beautiful quote of John Paul, there is a mutual exchange, of course, absolutely, because it's a covenant. And
Mhm.
there have been many articles I've read, on adoption, because sometimes, in our pro-life movement, we don't talk about this topic, this beautiful topic, enough. And sometimes when it is talked about, it's kind of a response, to the
Mhm.
anti-life culture. But we really should speak of this on its own, in its own beauty, in its own
Mhm.
way of looking at a covenantal relationship that happens.
Mhm.
And so and even though here it's a covenant, means it's relational, and so
Mhm.
it's a mutual benefit. But
Yeah.
always it really should start with what is the good for this child?
Mhm.
And it's not just the physicality issues, a home, shelter, food. Those are a given. But in reality is for parents to be thinking, or potential adoptive parents to be thinking, is praying about this and being open, to the possibilities of this child. And I mean, I think of one of our own board members. He and his wife, have welcomed, children into their home that may not have been given that opportunity because their ethnic background is very different than their own. And so,
Mm.
but they opened themselves without any restriction. In a sense, they just said, we're open, and whatever the Lord wishes for us, we will receive. And they did. And I know many couples like that. And so each couple's got to ask those questions, and so, but it's always thinking of the other. And then you never know what the child's demands will be because you don't know. But isn't that the beauty of even begetting a child through conjugal love?
was
You
gonna
don't
s
know what this child is going to bring.
Yeah, I was gonna say, sometimes you get blindsided by that with your own children as well,
Right,
so.
exactly. So it's that's why that openness, and that's
Mhm.
why that sense of procreation has to be in the mindset, and the sense of and it's also a covenant. It's a relationship. And as Pope John Paul said, it's that exchange
Mhm.
and that mutual giving of self and receiving. Because as we again connecting this to conjugal love, it's not only husband giving and wife giving, but it's receiving from the other. And so here, the fruit of that reception is always the potentiality of a third, a
Mhm.
child. And in adoption, of course, we're already thinking of a child that already is,
Mhm.
that's already been born or maybe soon to be born into this world, or it could be a teenager.
Mhm.
I'm thinking of a couple in New Zealand, who's been in our wonderful movement for almost 4 decades, who has welcomed children, who were going to be abandoned,
Yeah.
and potentially lost because they had special need. And
Mm.
so they opened themselves, and the majority of their children are children of special need. And every time I'm with them, I mean, it just yanks at my own heart to see the demand,
Yeah.
but the love and the sacrifice that's been made. So and that's why it should be something prayed. That's why it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
Adoption is not for everyone. And so because there's so many of those unknowns that may be out there, so that's why I have to pray about it.
Exactly. No, you're talking about the teenagers made me think of the old movie with Cary Grant, Room for One More. And at one point in that movie, the mother of the family is going to like look into a fostering, I believe, or I don't remember if she's looking into adoption but she ends up fostering, and they show up and the woman who's running the orphanage is basically like, "Yep, we have people waiting for like 2 years out to try to have like to adopt one of the babies." And she's like, "Please, like asking this whole group of women who are coming to like look into at the orphanage to
Right,
consider adoption. She's like, "Please consider fostering one of the teenagers." Like nobody wants the teenagers. Everyone just wants a baby. And
right,
so of course the mother in the movie, I
right,
forget which actress plays her, is just like, "Of course I'll take
right.
one of the daughters or one of
Yeah,
the girls." But
absolutely. And you think of, I mean, the church has been so involved in caring for others, since her inception,
Mhm.
always looking toward the good of others and service of others. And so this is only fitting, that the church herself has been an advocate,
Mhm.
and very much actively involved. And that's why I was so disheartened. And I don't want to change the subject, but I was so disheartened, during, many of the legal battles here in the United States,
Mm.
and especially with the legalization of same-sex unions, that sadly many of or several of the adoption agencies, Catholic agencies and so forth, decided no longer to be involved because of the difficulties
Mhm.
legally, and the challenges. And though I wish they would have fought the good fight and ran the race, because there's a beautiful gift in this ministry, this
Mhm.
service, and the church has been a part of this for centuries. and
Yeah.
uh, and I love to see us return to that value, because like John Paul makes note of in this audience. This is in 2000. Now we're 25 years later now, and
Wow,
but
yeah.
you think about, he makes note of how many children and young people are in need globally. And so if we think about that, that, and I see this with my own eyes,
Mhm.
in different countries, especially in the developing world, where because of natural disasters, human tragedies that occur, that many children are left alone.
Mhm.
And so and to have an opportunity to give that child a home
Yeah.
and to be loved. It's so beautiful, and at the same time, if I may, I'm gonna put a little my typical little comma without treating the child like a commodity.
Yes. Yeah.
And again, it just breaks my heart, to hear from the U.S. perspective how expensive this process has been.
Mhm.
And I don't want to get sidetracked on talking only about that, but it is something that we ought to address.
Mhm.
And I know that there are costs and legal costs and all these little things involved, but we should strive to make that as minimal as possible. And I think that's where the church can come into that equation,
Mhm.
because we have such great people out there in the legal arena, in the medical vocation, that can partner in
Mhm.
these and to bring things to a reasonable cost, in a sense, an administrative cost, or
Mhm.
handling what needs to be handled, but never the child having a price tag.
Yeah.
It should never be that way. And but for some, it is. It's so expensive that people just don't think it's possible.
Mhm.
And so we need to address that, and that's a different day. But I mean, but it does fit into this,
It
because
does, yeah.
John Paul does talk about it somewhat in acknowledging that reality.
Exactly. Well, and also to go back to my original comment or original question about how adoption fits into a culture of life. Often people who are pro-abortion or like at least anti-pro-life just like throw the, well, you only care about babies before they're born. Like, what are you doing for babies after they're born? And
Right,
I've just known so many pro-lifers who just generously opened their hearts up to adoption.
right,
And obviously, like you said, not everyone is called to it, but there is
right,
just such a great generosity that the people who claim that pro-lifers don't care about life after birth are just
right.
completely wrong.
Exactly. And and because we start with a simple premise, every life is a gift.
Mhm,
Every life has equal value. And, the circumstance that has brought that life into existence is a life that is good and worthy of life itself.
mhm,
And one thing about this beautiful movement that's always, just thinking, it's kind of interesting today, just in prayer, just thinking of what a privilege it is to be part of this movement, and to be part of something bigger than myself.
yeah,
And this is exactly what we're talking about, is that the movement is concerned about the dignity of every person. And in this situation, it's always being there for that need. And so it's very tragic that we have this closed mindset that the abortion industry feeds, and the false narrative
mhm,
that it continues to assert, and that should be completely denounced, because the movement has always been concerned about all the parties involved.
mhm,
And I say this, you tell me who else is out there opening their hearts and opening their lives, and welcoming life, and being willing to make the sacrifices to give another life. And how many are out there sacrificing their own good and their own prosperity to donate to causes that support pregnancy care centers, foster centers, that are working to provide shelters. And the other side of the aisle is not doing any of that. and
mhm,
so and so it's a false narrative, and it's always good for us, as we're doing right now, to denounce it, because
mhm.
it is a flat out lie. And this great movement really puts themselves on that front line and says, here I am. It's a modern day Good
Mhm.
Samaritan. It really,
Yeah.
really is. And it doesn't count the cost.
It's interesting because as you were saying that, what just like first came to mind is how quick people can be to adopt animals from animal shelters or donate to their local animal shelter.
Mm,
And not that any of that is wrong per se, but just like in a sense, in today's culture, it's more normal to do something like that, to have a
mm,
rescue animal than it is to consider
mhm.
adopting a child.
Right,
And I'm to know that there's a lot of factors
right,
that go into that. It's just
right,
something that had never occurred to me until you were just
right.
talking now.
Well, when we have become desensitized to the value of human life. I mean, as we know that, and this is what, again, just as when people run toward abortion
Mhm.
as quote unquote a remedy,
Yeah.
it is never the remedy. So if we removed that from the equation entirely, what would be the reaction? We would step forward.
Mhm.
We would find a path forward. And I think that's the real challenge. And that's not the reason, quote unquote, for adoption as a standalone,
Mhm.
but the idea, but it is part, of what opens people's hearts, to consider adoption, because they want to be able to offer to others that in a given situation, as we find in many of these moments, when a mom or dad are
Mhm.
not able to provide for their child at this given moment of time. And even after providing the means to help them as much as possible, they discern that, that no, this what's best for our child
Mhm.
is to place the child into the arms of another person or couple to
Mhm.
be able to provide for them, which we cannot do. And so
Yeah.
now we have open adoption, so there can be still relationship that happens, which is
Mhm.
beautiful, for those that choose that path. So this is a beautiful thing that I just would love to see more and more people. And for those that might be have influence under the Trump administration, I would say that in this moment of openness and discussion, this is a topic that I would hope that maybe would be brought to the attention of the
Mhm.
Trump administration to look at funding,
Mhm.
properly, morally,
Yeah.
ethical means forward of promoting adoption, and maybe looking at how to fund the agencies, that not commodifying a child, but really working
Mhm.
in this regard to help children in need and to provide an opportunity, as John Paul said, for that mutual exchange of love where people can approach. Yeah, it's the challenge that we have, Colleen, is that in modern society, and this is the big challenge, and that's what I said earlier, why some decided to close their doors, to shutter their doors because of the issues of same-sex couples, and
Mhm.
that whole situation that needs to be dealt with. And obviously, we cannot advocate for that, nor would we advocate for that.
Mhm. But it does make it challenging if you have a Catholic center that is, like, running an adoption agency,
Right,
then having to navigate that on a legal landscape. I
right,
can
right.
understand that, yeah.
And there's many challenges, but that's what needs to be challenged. It
Mhm.
needs to be challenged.
Yeah. How can couples know if they're called to adoption? What advice would you have for anyone listening who,
Yeah.
like, either has never considered it or it's, like, kind of that's floated the idea in their mind before, but they've never actually pursued it? What would you say to
Sure.
them?
I mean, having worked with couples, who were discerning and and considering this beautiful opportunity of opening themselves
Mhm.
and welcoming a child or a young person in this regard, and that really is starting with prayer. It really
Mhm.
is to put oneself before the Lord and be submissive to His will,
Mhm.
and to trust, that if there's something that's stirring within, it's also bringing what is the stir, what is happening, and to actually have a kind of a third person. In that situation I served as that is
Mhm.
kind of an objective outsider, always open to that wonderful gift, but also recognizing, what are the reasons, let's talk them out. What are your motivations? What are your why? And
Mhm.
so it's and then listening to them and just walking with them in that journey, and then opening doors for them
Mhm.
to do that. So it starts in prayer, starts in discernment, and really motivations. What
Mhm.
are the goals here? And sometimes it could be where you're completely unexpected. I mean, I know one couple whose was a family member, husband and wife, both were killed,
Mhm.
and unfortunately no one anticipates that all of us do
Yeah.
these great tragedies, and they had not made any plans for
Mm.
their children, at least in a legal manner. And so they turned toward immediate family first. And this uh, wonderful brother and husband, a wife, excuse me, opened themselves and said, let's pray about this. We definitely want to do what's best for these children. Are we the ones?
Mhm.
And so it really is. So there are many circumstances that
Yeah.
will thrust someone into that moment.
Yeah.
And normally, as you said earlier, it's typically what people think is it's ones, quote unquote, couples that can't have children. That's not been my experience all the time. It really has been these unexpected incidences that occur that push someone into something to think about. And in some cases, yes, it is a couple that's been, not been able to conceive and
Mhm.
now is praying about this.
For couples who already have biological children who are considering adopting, what
Yeah.
should they be considering when they're, like, discerning this process?
That's a wonderful question because it's one that really every couple should be praying about.
Mhm.
Because it really is opening. As I said earlier, just quoting John Paul and using the language, even Pope Francis is going to use that similar language. And I'm going to make reference to Pope Francis real quick because it opens this conversation. He says one of the highest forms of parenthood is to take on the responsibility of becoming adoptive parents. So it
Okay.
fits really beautifully in. He says, prepare to welcome an orphaned or abandoned child as part of your own family.
Hmm.
So, in a sense, that it really is not someone that doesn't have that is the one that should be praying about this.
Hmm.
It really is, even families that have been blessed to be able to welcome children,
Hmm.
through conjugal love, to pray about this and to be open. And what a beautiful, and it's not that you're trying to teach your children, in a sense, it's a lesson, because you don't commodify a child that way, but it's a great, wonderful way of stretching the family's love.
Hmm.
And that love is never meant to be bound. It's meant to grow, to expand. According to Pope Benedict, and it can be stretched and stretched and stretched. It knows no limit because God is love.
Yeah.
And so when we think about how that a family should pray, and
Hmm.
especially if we have older children, is to pray as a family. And I know wonderful couples,
Hmm.
that welcomed 2, 3 children in their life, and then prayed hard
Hmm.
about, because they become so active in their faith, and you can't help but hear the gospel, right?
Hmm.
We have become adopted sons and daughters of the Heavenly Father.
Yeah.
Why should I not consider this? We hear about covenant
Yeah.
constantly in the scripture. You know, why would I not be praying with that? And so couples ought to be praying,
Hmm.
and thinking again, and not because every couple is meant to adopt,
Yeah.
but there are many more out there that are
What
being
should
called.
How much should they be considering their own biological children in that discernment process? Because obviously, before adopting a child, like if you're discerning it, your primary duty is to your biological children first, and then if you adopt that child, then
Right,
becomes part of the group, and then
right.
if you're discerning again, you're taking the adoptive child into account. So I don't want it to make it sound like couples that have adopted and also have biological children have a first primary duty to their biological children, but, like, in the process of discerning, first you have to look at the family that God has given you
Mhm.
and determine whether or not you should add another child to that. What what should they be considering? What would they have to take into account?
Well, it's a question I have been asked before,
Mhm.
and my response has always been, and I say this, a little kind of little tongue in cheek, kind
Okay.
of thing, is the idea that parent doesn't go to, when they're uh, open to more children and discuss, we're thinking about having a third child or a fourth child, and kind of talk with the children. I think what's important is the parents is to have an atmosphere of openness within the family.
Okay.
And I think that is what stirs other children's hearts, to recognize, that our parents are just so giving,
Mhm.
so the love that's in this home is just so there's no boundary to it, and they feel it. And so it doesn't mean you can't discuss things, obviously. I mean, I know
Mhm.
parents that, what would you think about if we welcomed another baby in the family, already
Mhm.
knowing that they're pregnant, just kind of trying to get the children to talk about it. But I think here it's just, again, it's that atmosphere, it's that culture within the family. And it almost becomes a natural response of a child or a young adult when I mean, we all have our weaknesses, and we all can be self-centered at times. And it
Mhm.
doesn't mean a kid's not going to think, well, how's it going to affect me? Of course,
Mhm.
of course. But how mom and dad convey that culture of life in the family,
Mhm.
and say that we should always be open to life, whether that be through the fruit of our own love,
Mhm.
or whether that be for the fruit of the love of our family, and how we open our home, to others, and all families do this in their own way, right? Sometimes it's a sick family member, sometimes it's the grandparents, an uncle. People, are stretched in so many ways. And I just wish that people would think more about stretching this way,
Mhm.
and to realize that there are so many young people from infants, toddlers, all the way up into their teenage years that are just wanting to be loved.
Yeah.
And especially as they age, as you said earlier, it gets more difficult, because people are afraid of, taking someone in that's already got baggage and so forth. And
Mhm.
and but we that's part of love. Again, it's unbounded. It's not meant to. It's supposed to be unrestricted.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you don't take reasoning and look at things, of
Mhm.
course, but the idea is openness. So that's what procreation is. It's pro-life. It's pro-openness.
Yeah.
So I think my suggestion always has been to couples who have asked me this question, well, how is it going to be impact your children? Well, it depends on the age of your children. If
Mhm.
they're old enough to have a reasonable conversation, yeah, talk to them. Obviously open them up to this and respond to them.
Mhm.
if they think something selfishly, address that, you know? So it's the idea because what would happen if mom and dad conceived another child? Would you have the same mindset?
Yeah.
You gotta push. You gotta push against the selfish tendency. And that's why it really has to go back to your first question. It has to start in prayer. It has to start in discernment. It has to start with this openness. Here I am, Lord. We are open. We are welcoming. We would, as gladly as we would welcome a new life through the fruit of our own love, this love is also open, to others, an adoptive love, a kind of a adoptive procreative love, if I can put a term or a phrase around it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a question. Should single adults adopt? Because
Ah,
I've definitely heard people say before that it's better that a child be raised by a single mom or a single dad than to grow up in an orphanage or grow up in the foster care system.
right,
But I've also heard people say that no, a child should grow up like deserves to grow up with a mom and a dad if possible, so the only people adopting should be like married couples. What are your
right.
thoughts on this topic?
So there's a wide variety of thought. So let's just kind of go back to the child. So what is God's design for a child? That
Mhm,
a child be welcomed by mom and dad, their
mhm,
own biological parents, and then raised within that family unit, be nurtured by one's mom and dad. But as you just said, there are circumstances that sometimes are thrust upon a child, upon a family that are the unknowns.
mhm,
A tragedy occurs. Mom or dad may be lost to cancer, an illness,
mhm,
an accident. And so obviously now we have a single parent home. So single parent home is not always necessarily, as we've talked about before, because of outside, an act outside of marriage.
mhm,
So sometimes a child may find themselves being raised by their own mom or their own dad because the other parent is gone, is passed.
mhm,
So always in that situation, as we even say when working with young moms who have an unplanned pregnancy, is that the child is always best being raised by their own parent.
mhm,
And so in God's design, parents, mom and dad, in this situation, a single family. Now, when it comes to adoption, I mean, you can have people that are very much open, as we've been talking about, and want to open their lives to a child. I've not seen anything that would dissuade, that would be morally wrong.
mhm,
Ideally, and I use that word ideal because of using that word with regard to God's design, we
mhm,
know a child benefits both from a mother and a father, and that would be what's best for the child. All right. And so this is where we would want to direct people to be open to that. And so at the same time, I'm not seeing anything, from our church teaching or from the bishops in general to
mhm,
dissuade, but always even John Paul always points out, that it's what's best for the child. So sometimes, you might have a person who has the vocation of the single life is a
mhm,
vocation. And we got to remember that. But at the same time, that single state doesn't mean it has to be opposed to being a parent
mm.
in this sense, an adoptive parent, all
Yeah.
right, in this situation. And that's what we're talking about specifically here.
Yes.
But that's again back to prayer, because that person also has to be able to ask, not only providing, so again, not so much the physical and financial responsibilities, but
Mhm,
also the spiritual. How do we compensate, for the need if it's a man that wants
mhm,
to adopt, or if it's a woman how do I, they say, I hate that word compensate, but how do I deal with the fact that if it's a female, how do I deal with the fact of what father images can I bring into this child's life?
mhm,
So there's many things that need to be asked. And
mhm,
that's where, again, I think that objective voice, speaking to a good person, those who are involved in this beautiful ministry. I don't want to use industry, ministry, because what it should be, it's ministering to someone because we're dealing with a human person, is to talk it out, and talk to people who've been down the path, and maybe even talking to more so what I always did is talk to someone who was put into the situation not by their own choice. The
mm.
spouse died. Talk to them. What are the struggles? What are
Yeah.
the difficulties? And so here, it could be, and maybe sometimes it could be foster care that
Mhm,
what might be the better option, instead of legally adopting, but opening one's home
mhm,
to fostering someone. Just think of parents, what they go through raising and guiding a child through those wonderful journeys of puberty and adolescence and all that wonderful journey. So that single person needs to ask those questions.
yeah.
How do I where do I turn when I have those kinds of questions? Where do I supplement, if I may say it that way? I don't like using those terms, but that's really what it is. How do I balance the other needs?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's why we always, and since we don't, like I said, in dealing with the subject, and you and I know, and when we're talking, getting ready to talk about this, I said, let me go and look at a couple of things because, what has the church spoken on this?
Mhm,
And even when writing about it, I've never seen anything, again, to dissuade
mhm,
as much as just to put a pause and say to the person who's in the single state asking those questions, same questions,
mhm.
motivations, how are you going to deal with this, and so forth and so on. So yeah, it's the same questions, just maybe a little more in the sense of being open to talking to people and being able to answer those questions.
A little extra challenging,
Right.
basically. Yeah. What do you think some of the biggest challenges or hurdles that couples who want to adopt in today's day and age are facing? And then, like, how can we as a church help them, like, maybe overcome some of those challenges? It sounds like financial is the biggest one.
Right, and I love how you just said the end of it, and that is how can the church,
Mhm,
because this is both what Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II, of recent memory, all articulated.
mhm,
What are we doing as a church, as a people of God, to respond to the needs of others? And so here is another example. So, I remember, a religious sister, whose home, the home for children is still open in my diocese. I knew Sister Rosario quite well. And so she was very fortunate to have lay families that actually supported the ministry that she did in caring for children in need, foster care, and also helping place children up for adoption. And these were children that were for various reasons and typically coming from very difficult situations that she and the sisters raised and cared for. It's still open today, and even though she's passed from this world, and so what happened is lay donors come in and provide the means to care for the children. So this is an example. So it's one thing, as we've said on so many of our pro-life issues, put your money where your mouth is. It's not
mhm,
a matter of just speaking a principle. How do we advocate for that principle? How do we support that principle? So if we're saying we're a people for life, and we are,
mhm,
what are we doing to put in this particular apostolic work?
mhm.
And to look at it as a ministry,
Yeah.
to really see this, because why? Again, as I said, because we're serving the human person.
Mhm,
And so I would say, as using John Paul's language, what are we doing to build this campaign?
yeah.
What systems are we creating to support this? How are we addressing this need in a diocesan structure? I think
Mhm.
that's a legitimate question to the local bishop. Among all the many things he's got on his plate, this is one of them that needs to be out there. How are we addressing this through our Catholic charities, through our St. Vincent de Paul Society, or
Mhm,
whatever structure there is? How is it being addressed? Maybe Knights of Columbus could assist with this. Maybe Followers of Mary, whatever the structures are,
mhm,
and also from the legal point of view. What about, again? I don't want to put all the burden upon the bishop, but the bishop, who is the shepherd of the local church, has such powerful influence.
mhm,
To be able to reach out to attorneys in the community, what could we do to either do pro bono,
mhm,
or how could we minimize cost? Bishop can reach out to the medical community, to doctors and nurses. What could we do here? If you come across a situation, what means could we now create where that we can now make these options available? What can we do to help you? What can you do to help us?
mhm,
We also know that, for couples that are open, you just mentioned it, economic issues are real. What can we do? Again, back to medical care. How can we lower medical costs? How
mhm,
can we have more tax incentives to help incentivize the possibilities? I mean, there's so many ways of approach. And I mean, if I were in that kind of authority,
mhm,
how can I meet with a legitimate civil authority? Maybe sitting down with the governor's office, maybe sitting down with the so what could we do to
mhm,
create a conversation? And the challenge will always be is not to commodify it, not to turn it into an industry, but to really recognize that this is a service to the human person, and it begins with the person, not necessarily always not with the couple.
mhm,
So even though, again, we're talking about a mutual exchange, but John Paul made it very clear, Pope Francis made it clear, Church makes it clear. We're talking about a human being. We're talking about a person with inalienable dignity It's not a commodity, not a thing. It's not a purchase, not a product. How do we serve that individual? And how can we make the means possible to help foster that kind of approach? That, to me, is where the church, not only in principle, has to continue to hold, but also to advocate for and to find a way. And sometimes it's us that has to do it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that for centuries. And we're still
Yeah.
doing it. I mean, I've been around the world. I mean,
Yeah.
I meet dioceses all over the world that are still heavily, heavily involved in adoptive ministries and in providing adoption. So I know it's very active.
Okay, I would be remiss to talk about this on the podcast and not ask you about Imre's adoptive program in Hungary, which I realized wasn't actually on my questions. I was brainstorming when I was coming up with this podcast. Could you just tell our audience a little bit about what Imre and HLI Hungary do to help with adoption?
Right. So what Colleen is referencing to our audience is Dr. Imre Teglase, who is HLI's affiliate director in Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
And so Dr. Imre has been involved in this now for well over 3 decades. Just like so many of our pro-life leaders around the world, is just a phenomenal man,
Mm-hmm.
a faithful husband, wonderful father, who's dedicated himself, to promoting the culture of life.
He was also on the podcast last fall because he was survived an abortion, so he
Right.
came on and shared his story. So I'll link
Exactly.
that for you for our audience to
So that
listen
way
to.
people can meet him face to face. And
Exactly.
so what Imre has been doing by working twofold. So one is working with government,
Mm-hmm.
and Hungary right now, I would say, is probably one of the stronger pro-life environments
Mm-hmm.
now in government, open, receptive.
Yeah.
Still a lot of room to grow, but it's very open. And he's been able to navigate waters and to open up doors. And so by looking at how do we advocate for life, and so in situations where a couple may find themselves where, for whatever reason, they feel like they cannot,
Mm-hmm.
give the benefits to the child that the child needs, they know that through the various programs that Imre has been able to set up, that they can approach
Mm-hmm.
and know that Imre and his team will find a family. And a lot of times it's not a matter of going out in a search. It happens almost, I mean, immediately. It's just so quickly how couples come to the surface.
Well, I think there's a vetting process too, where they have to like volunteer with Imre for a certain
Correct.
period of time so that
That's
he
right.
can make sure that they actually like aren't trying to commodify a child or doing it
Exactly.
for a selfish reason, but
Exactly.
actually want to be good Catholic
And
parents
that's
for the
why he's trying to
child.
open more homes, because right now that's one of the big challenges that we're trying to do, is where we can actually open homes for not only for moms in
Mm-hmm.
need, but families in need. But this is also the chance where Imre and his team are able to vet
Mm-hmm.
and to gives a place for people to volunteer,
Mm-hmm.
but it also gives them a chance to learn more about what is involved. So
Mm-hmm.
I think he's one of the beautiful models
Yeah.
that we need to start multiplying and duplicating. And it's interesting, when I was doing my thesis, for my master's in science and bioethics, I actually used some of his modeling,
Oh,
as a way
cool.
to kind of frame out my family life centers,
Yeah.
because it's really what it should be on a diocesan level in a local church. And Ray's trying to bring those together. So he's bringing the legal side. So
Mm-hmm.
what do we need to do to meet the legal requirements?
Mm-hmm.
How can we mitigate, the bureaucracy of it? Because we're dealing with a human being, all right,
Yeah.
not a thing. And then how do we bring in the church, in the sense of how can the church be an advocate here? And
Mm-hmm.
so how can the church help couples? How can the church help a couple in need, first of all, that has a reason, or a mom in need that has a reason, and then how can we help couples
Mm-hmm.
for what their reasons may be, who are open to another way of procreating,
Mm-hmm.
adoption. And so how do we help them? And Imre is meeting all those roads, and really kind of, in a way, all roads lead to Imre. And it's in a sense that he's been able to successfully place children in adoptive homes and be so fruitful and happy. And it's a wonderful modeling. So it is, maybe this would be a good way of a follow-up podcast, Colleen, to maybe bring Emery back on
Yeah.
and to
Talk
follow
about.
up on this beautiful process that he's been able to develop with his team.
Yeah.
And I know that others have. We had our European leaders meeting last May, almost a year now, and Imre shared the process,
Mm-hmm.
and many of the other leaders from Europe were looking
Mm-hmm.
at this, and I know he's been working with them, trying to help them so that maybe they themselves
Yeah.
can start looking how to implement it.
Oh, that's beautiful. I also know he did something with the nurses in Hungary where
That's right.
women who are abortion vulnerable, so
Right.
like meet with nurses, and there's like two societies of nurses, and so he wasn't able to get into the ones that are like specifically abortion related because they're pro-abortion, but then
Right.
the other nurses who are just the general nurses at the hospital, he gave them like references to the adoption center so that women who are
Correct.
trying to decide whether they're going to keep their baby or have an abortion, the nurses can be like, well, if you considered adoption, this
Right.
place can help you out.
I was amazed when I was last with Dr. Emre in Hungary, visiting hospitals, visiting centers. The in the sense of his outreach, the
Hmm.
network that's required, which kind of goes
Yeah.
back to your previous question: how do we make all this happen? What can we do? It really is a network you're building, and which, in a way, is fulfilling John Paul II's wish
Hmm.
to build a great campaign in the support of life.
Yeah.
I personally think Imre is an example of that
Hmm.
because it takes a network.
Yeah.
And what you're doing also is you're creating a mindset, a culture of life, so that from nurses to doctors to lawyers to politicians, everyone's got a part to play in this. Here we're speaking specifically about adoption, but we can say the same thing of all the other aspects.
Hmm.
It's a great example. And so that's why I used it, kind of as a model because it really captures, I really believe what John Paul is talking about this campaign.
Hmm.
So I'm glad you're going to link it, and I think it'd
Yeah.
be wonderful to bring Emery back on. Maybe we can do a tag team.
That'd be really fun. Yeah, no, I'm glad. I literally was like prepping this podcast, and then in the middle of it, I'm like, wait a minute. Emery just has this a great example of his
Exactly.
adoption program. I love reading
Right.
the stories from the mission field that he'll send of different children who, for some reason or other, the parents weren't able
Right.
to raise them. And then
Exactly.
this other couple who would just like open their hearts to adoption were able to take the child in, and the good relationships that build sometimes between the biological parents and the
That's right.
adoptive parents as well.
That's right. And I know that Lech and Ava Kowaleska
Hmm.
in Poland, I've been with them as well, have seen a very similar, I don't like that word, program, but this wonderful
Ministry.
ministry. And so, and having been in a place that HLI Poland is supporting
Hmm.
and making available not only to care for moms in need, but when that situation presents itself where she feels that she's unable,
Hmm.
then there's another process that begins.
Yeah.
And so I've been there, and it's a beautiful, again, a wonderful ministry. I know the same thing is happening, was happening in Ukraine
Hmm.
with
Again, yeah.
Genya,
Yeah.
and so now, of course, right now that's very difficult under the current situation that's happening in Ukraine with the situation with Russia, and so, but that ministry is still there, and I know it's still there because I hear stories about what she's doing. So hopefully, once those things are reconciled,
Mhm.
in the current situation and peace is reestablished, hopefully again you will again be able to carry out that ministry. So that's why pulling the leaders together is so beautiful because you hear what others are doing,
Mhm.
and that's what I think I love about our podcast the most is that because we're bringing light to what many people would not hear about,
Yeah.
especially globally.
Yeah.
We hear a lot in the United States, and praise God for the ministries that are here, but not
Mhm.
everybody talks about or engaged on the international level. And I can tell you the Home for the Angels in the Philippines is it was one of my first places I visited,
Mm.
and that goes back to Sister Pilar, that was a very good friend of Father Paul Marks, our founder,
Oh,
and that
wow.
ministry began, if I remember the date, in 1977. And so, and I know that Congressman Lito Atienza and his wife Bing Atienza, at last, when I was with him a year ago, had adopted well over almost 600 children themselves, and then those children are placed up for adoption. So they take on the Atienza name. So these are children that come to the home of the angels, cared for by his own family and others who donate the food and the shelter. And I've been to the home, several times. And it's another example. That's why that's not one way. There's many ways of approachment.
Okay, can you explain that a little bit better so I understand it? So,
So
because
what
obviously
happens?
that couple isn't raising
No.
600 children.
Well, in the
So,
beginning they are because what happens is and that's over since 1977 now, okay?
okay.
Now there's been many other children that have come through. That means more than just the 600, but they themselves legally, and what happens is it gives the child a legal name,
Mm.
being and being loved by a family, so that now they have a so on the legal side,
Mhm.
those
So they're
those
adopted twice, basically.
in a
Like
way, that's
this
right,
couple
that's
takes
correct.
on the like legal responsibility for
Ability,
the child, and
right,
then they
until an
find a home.
adoptive home can be found. So till that time, they're cared for in the home of the angels, or sometimes they were cared in the Atienza home. are
Hmm.
cared for by the. It's a beautiful ministry. Sister Pilar has passed from this world. Lito and Ms. Bing are still very active, and Lito, he probably would shoot me, but he's in a sense, I think he's in his either late 70s, early 80s now, still very active. And so it's just beautiful to see. And every time I'm with him, it's great joy, and that's love. That
Yeah.
goes back to the beginning of our of our podcast. To adopt a child is a great work of love,
Mhm.
and this is what they've done. So and so I can give a litany of examples. From Latin America, I've been many places.
Mhm.
For that same ministries. So I think it's good for our audience to hear that this is nothing new.
Mhm.
The church has been involved in this great ministry very early on,
Yeah.
and still is very active. And
Mhm.
as I said, though in the United States you might not hear it so much, but that's, I would say, my what I've seen mostly has been because of legal challenges and the legal issues. But in other parts of the world, they're not faced by the same,
Mhm.
and so the opportunities are much more there. So I would say it's time to break those barriers down. And I'm hoping that as we go forward in time, that our shepherds, our bishops, and the various agencies that they minister and administrate may revisit this conversation again.
Yeah.
I really think that when you think that there are a million little boys and girls in the United States that lose their life to the violence of abortion,
Mhm.
that this is a conversation that needs to be brought to the surface in sense of adoption.
Mhm.
These are children that are loved and wanted, and even though their parents may not have that same sentiment in that beginning stage, that sentiment can change, and and maybe help them give life to your child and allow your child to be loved and welcomed, even though you right now can't.
Mhm.
And that is our message still. I mean, but we need to grow that message.
Well, I think even going back to the idea that couples who already have biological children could adopt too, that's just
That's correct.
the idea of welcoming more than 1 or 2 children is already kind of foreign to our secular to the
Right.
secular audience in
That's right.
America in today's day and age, and so then the idea of welcoming biological children and then adoptive children on top of that is something that's just so
Right.
far from the secular norm in some ways,
Right.
unless it's a couple who adopts first and is then able to conceive,
So what's the
and I think
message?
it's so good to just remind people that that is an
Exactly.
option, and, this might not be
Exactly.
something that's, immediately on your radar because you don't see it in today's world, but it's still something worth
So the
considering.
message really is, I mean, interrupt you there, but just I
Okay.
think the message really has to be even step back further. It really is preaching the gospel of life.
Mhm.
That's where it has to start. So once we start, if we preach this consistently
Mhm.
and often,
Yeah.
then it stretches people. And it's not pointing a finger. It's not using a difficulty as the reason. They're there,
Mhm.
but really it's the gospel.
Yeah.
It's preaching the gospel. That's why this wonderful insight or way of approachment that our holy fathers of recent memory have shared with us really is procreative. It's so we have to stretch people. And you just gave an example. We already have an issue where
Mhm.
people are closed to the possibility of life beyond a number. So
Mhm.
that's a challenge, and we've done a very not so good job in challenging that narrative. And because we have a contraceptive mindset.
Yeah.
Well, if we have a procreative mindset, open, so maybe we have a contraceptive mindset toward adoption as well, just as
Mm.
we have in conjugal love. So we need to challenge that mindset. So let's challenge that contraceptive mindset. And so it requires preaching. So I would say to any of my brothers, who are maybe listening to our podcast, and I say this with all the charity of my heart, are we preaching this? Are we teaching this? And I've read several articles that actually challenge priests,
Yeah.
pastors of souls. Do we preach this message? Do we preach and not from the negative? All right. There are realities. Preach them, yes, but from the good and the true and the beautiful, which is procreative love. So let's talk about that. And then as diocesan bishops, is obviously we don't expect our shepherds to be the uh, carry the load alone. No, but the idea is from our shepherds to raise the conversation,
Mhm.
to make it part of their ministry in the local church, and then to find fostering ways to foster that, to
Yeah.
encourage it. That's why the Lord gave them the keys of governance and teaching and sanctification.
Yeah.
They are the shepherd of the local church. So we need our bishops involved in this conversation, heavily involved in this conversation.
Yeah. Well, amen. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Father. I'm glad to kind of dedicate a full episode to this because we've had it bits and pieces and all sorts of episodes. And
Well, you're
I
welcome.
don't think we've ever done one just talking about it, just adoption as a topic in and of
Well,
itself.
I'm glad we
So,
had the chance, and I look forward to many more opportunities. Maybe again, as I'm saying, the challenge that I just gave is also directed at us.
yeah.
I know we write about it. I know we definitely. I know I write about it. But and as I said in some of our articles, we need to bring this to the surface more often.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I think that's a challenge to us as well.
Definitely. And to our audience, if you have any questions on this topic or any comments, anything you'd like to know more about this in the future, please let us know in the comments. Because if we're going to keep revisiting this topic, I want to be able to, answer your questions. So thank you, Father, for joining us
You're
today.
welcome, Colleen. Look forward to the next chance.
Look forward to it as well, Father. And to our audience, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review, subscribe to the show, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.